And we are live. Sound check. Okay, so hello and welcome to this new series in which we will be discussing cities, housing, their problems. Of course, inevitably debunk some myths which have been thrown around, and sure, why not propose some solutions. So I am the Moth. This is my channel, Memories of the Future. Welcome. Do listen, ask questions in the chat, and I will bring like today's guest, Leone. Hello
Hello.
there. Oh, welcome, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on. It'll be a fun time today, I think.
Yes,
So yeah.
and maybe we shall have a series, like I said, a series, and because there are like plenty of problems, and to imagine that all these problems will be able to solve them and explain them properly in one single episode is a bit naive.
Absolutely. Constructing a better society is a very non-trivial project, so it has to be you have to take care and go about it very methodically, very rigorously, and that takes time.
Yeah, and this is sort of a thing I've heard lately. Too many people saying, "Hey, since we don't have the power, or since we will take power in 100 years, or like we be able to change the establishment and how things work somewhere in the far, far future, maybe on a different galaxy, like they say in Star Wars or something. We shouldn't worry too much about the short term or the implementable solutions. And I believe that is a failure of not only strategy, but just as a mindset.
Yeah, this is a manifestation of the kind of it's a specific type of status quo bias to think that there are no other possible legal institutional systems that you could set up to organize and run a healthy society. And this has to be dispelled with, but you know, imagination is something that takes time and effort to cultivate. So I'm hoping that the discussion today will kind of give a glimpse at the kind of analysis that one needs to perform to figure out how to make those kinds of strategic adjustments to your societal legal structure, such that you can work towards a better future in a real way, in a real tangible, physical way. And urban planning is very close to step one. It's not step one, but it's close to it.
Yep, totally agree. Oh, by the way, would you like to introduce yourself in a couple of words? Or
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Leon. I am a physics grad student in the US, and I have been studying political science, legal theory, social political theory, and so on and so forth for the last probably 6 years on my own. Um, and yeah, I'm looking forward to some good discussion here.
and we've met in a Marxist-Leninist Discord. Does this topic of urban planning must be something that must be discussed as a Marxist-Leninist STEM-based project, or it should be approached and gotten regardless of whether you are a Marxist or not.
So the problem of urban planning has to be approached from a position from any position, really, because it doesn't really matter what society uh, you're living under. You can have a variety of choices made at the local level for designing roads and streets and buildings and whatnot, and that can be divorced from the political system that you live under. So while I think that Marxist Leninist ideas contribute heavily to shining the light on, okay, here are some directions that we could take a given society. when it comes to urban planning, you can translate those ideas into urban planning. I don't think that it's necessary to be a Marxist-Leninist or some other flavor of leftist to engage with these ideas. No one likes sitting in traffic. No one likes noise pollution. It all sucks, and there are tangible solutions to get away from that. And uh, yeah, so
Yeah,
that just has to be explored regardless.
yep. I wanted to make that point because people might get the idea that all urban planning from the perspective of Marx, Lenin, and other type of leftist ideology. And I believe that, hey, regardless of your beliefs, we are living in the same city and we are having the same problems, encountering the same issues, and we shall engage ourselves in a process of solving, trying to come up with better solutions, not just to point fingers and oh, you're a Marxist or you're a Republican or whatever on the right, and we cannot collaborate and we cannot work together to immediately improve our conditions. That's why the the series is called Class and the City.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a bit of a trope coming from the stemming from the Marxist-Leninist idea, but I believe that the sarcastic thing inside it should touch very well on the other side of the spectrum, regardless of your beliefs in Marx or not.
Right. And if you are a Marxist or a Marxist-Leninist or whatever other flavor of leftist, then um, the conversation on urban planning is an area where you can directly apply your knowledge of how to perform a material analysis by analyzing the physical reality of living in a populated center in such and such country, whether that's where you live or where someone else lives. And if you are able to perform that kind of analysis, then you'll be able to think of, okay, these kinds of solutions make sense, and find some way to implement them. And yeah, that's just a good way to practice what you um, have been studying in your historical readings, in your political readings for the past however long you've been doing so.
Awesome. So let's sum up. What shall we talk about? I believe we definitely should touch upon the history of urban planning, not necessarily since the Romans and the Greek and even before them, but at least
Right.
we can mention them if there is something important in that. But usually from the early 1900s, we can talk about a sort of modern understanding of a city, because that is the moment when largely in parts of Eastern Europe and the USA, ideas like sewage and all sorts of utilities become more popular and are being implemented, because there are places like UK or France where this kind of ideas were implemented a bit before, and there were like traces till the 1600s when they are talking about improving the sewage system, and not to mention the ancient cities, because you might end up believing they were more advanced in certain ways than we were in the beginning of the 1900s. So yeah, a historical sort of journey of the city from the early 1900s before the communists came to power. Then what happened when the communists came to power? What sort of happened after the communist regime fell in Eastern Europe? And
Right.
sort of end up with the modern day, present day city and its problems. What do you think about it?
I think that that's appropriate. So when it comes to American urban planning, this analysis is totally fine. We can start that at the beginning of the modern era, where that I'm using the artistic and architectural lingo to describe that, kind of like turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s, and then onwards from there. And then when it comes to Europe, there's a much longer arc of history in how spaces for living have been designed. So there's some interesting continuity there that has carried over to modern times that you don't really see in the U.S. Where like cities like Phoenix, for instance, were designed with vehicular transport completely in mind, versus say Berlin or Paris or Budapest or Moscow, which have been around for hundreds of years, far before there was any kind of widespread vehicular transit. So the
Motorized.
historical inertia is much different in these arenas, and I think it'll be an interesting it'll be interesting and enlightening to go over the various forms that urban planning has taken.
Yeah, I was trying to get in the word motorized vehicles because they were having vehicles, just that they were horse-driven cattle walks or whatever power them, but not motorized vehicles until
Right.
very lately.
Okay. Yeah.
Alright, so I will get in with my first example, and that is from Romania, Bucharest. And it
Okay.
comes from the period of between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, and that is called the Interbellic Period, the period between wars, and certain people regard that period as being one of the most glamorous and awesome periods in the development in the history of Romania. And of course, you can find similar opinions about that time in other countries in Eastern Europe. You can definitely trace this trope across multiple countries. And why I want to touch on this is because I've seen this topic being brought up a lot in the debates, in discussions between people on the right or whatever, not Marxist-Leninists, and as a point against. And they always will tell you, of course, in a very dishonest and uneducated manner, that, oh, things are great in that time, and they will even show you pictures. Now, let me share my screen with you. Local source background. Okay. Shouldn't take too much. Okay, share screen. Okay, we are good. And of course, world map. We are all on this map. We don't discriminate. Romania, Bucharest. At that time, at the early 1900s, let's say 1920s, 30s, pretty much all of the Eastern Europe was medieval, agrarian, medieval, serfdom, which is slavery by any other name, just a tidy bit more small in its impact, but really not in its practice. So it was really a backward place. Okay, so this is the capital, and people are telling you
So
that
Eastern Europe then would be one of the last bastions of late feudalism before that just finally gave way to our modern systems of governance.
Yep, totally correct. Okay, so this is of course present day Bucharest, but these people will tell you that under the kings, in most of the Eastern Europe, and you would have kings before the communists, or sorts of manners, lower kings, bigger kings, queens, and such, and their camarillas, their group of friends, very corrupt. Okay, and they will tell you that this thing was great. Okay, and okay, it's shown. They will, if you search Interbellic Bucharest, you will find both on YouTube or just simply as pictures, lots of videos or photos from that era, which some of those photos look really nice and clean and stuff. There isn't exactly a problem. It looks almost like a modern day city in a more rural, not necessarily uh, center of New York, Manhattan, and stuff like that. It looks decent. So you have this kind of photo. What else? You have other type of. This is sort of a plaza in the city center. What else? Oh, another new building, quite modern for that time. And
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of interesting buildings that you will be shown. And of course, the trope. Oh, look how great things are! Another couple of buildings. The middle floors would be at the bottom floor at the street level. You'd have shops, and then maybe a layer of offices. But the other floors would be for living, and usually the top floors would be for servants, and they would be usually, if not all the time, very small and crammed with very unusual staircases. Okay, so you have all these buildings which, like, you cannot fault them for anything. The streets are wide, they look clean, and you might say, hey, but this is a nice city. I want to live in that kind of nice city. Well, the main problem with this is that most of these people, what they forget to tell you is that these photos are usually taken from a very, very small place in the middle of the Bucharest. Okay, and if that would be the entire city, you have like two streets. And let me see if I can draw. Yep, the okay, this. So you would have like, where is the not line? This is the city center, and from here you have up until here
Mm-hmm.
one street, and from largely not a circle, another line. Let's say around here. Oh, get
And
lost.
it's mostly in the city center where this kind of modernized development was concentrated, right?
Yes, yes, that's exclusively. And what most of these people forget to tell you is that outside of these very small areas, uh, there was poverty, like extreme poverty. And what I mean by extreme poverty, can I delete this? Yes, delete. Yes. This is the, like I said, the main. I no, I don't know how to use technology. It seems.
Technical errors.
Yes, yes. Thank you for understanding.
Yeah, they always happen. It's all good.
This is a new platform, and okay. So this was the main center area, but they will never. And of course, they will show you. Oh, come on, stay there. Stop. Anyway, they will show you only those main streets in the middle of the city, and of course they will show you like, hey, look, this is the railroad, the new railroad train house, not train house, the place where the train arrives, the train station. Jeez. And they will
Right.
tell you the train station, which is somewhere in this area, very close to the old to the city center. And the point is, they will show you that photo because that photo was done when the waiting saloon for royalties was being built. Okay, so
Right.
yeah,
So it services mostly that upper wealth sector of the city then.
yeah, exactly. And ultimately, you are being left with an extremely small area. But inside that extremely small area, you have like a very small amount of streets which are properly paved. The other are mud, and it's like awful to walk among them. You literally have zero sewage. You have zero current water. You have none of the utilities. And to talk about the amount of disease that were widespread in Bucharest at that time is like a horror story. But these people will come and tell you, like, oh, but look at those things which are great. Oh, and also, I've shown you around here, there are like these two awesome streets. Uh, in this area, you have domains, private domains, in which a huge amount of land belongs to a very high noble. Okay, so those
Right.
parts they kind of forget to tell you. There is another awesome picture which is somewhere around this area with a lake which belongs to also to an high-ranking general and stuff like that. All sorts of high-level politicians, high-level military people, and the friends of the kings. So yeah, you have awesome stuff happening there, but there weren't buildings for your average citizen. And not only that, most of the buildings we've seen are sort of governmental buildings. So while it's nice to see a city hall building being nice, I cannot live in that type of building because simply it's not for living. Okay, so if it's a museum or if it's an opera, Athenaeum kind of theater and stuff like that, me as a private individual, as a private citizen, I cannot live in that. It's nice to see such things, but it's not. I cannot use it.
It's like a daytime destination, not a place of residence, a place of living, a place of existing for long periods in that case.
Yeah, and of course, around this area, you can also find lots of trash pits, like literal dump pits, and lots of poor people are living in or directly close to these areas, but also inside these areas in order to have a better grip on that trash pit because they were searching through the trash to scavenge for all sorts of materials and try to recycle and do these things with them. And
Like
one
aluminum,
very
tin, copper, and so forth.
yeah, exactly. And there were some stories that sometimes you might find a gold ring, which if you are in extreme poverty, that would set you up for a good period of time. But what was an extreme kind of story in this context? Okay, so yeah, these are gypsies, minorities, which are of course set free. They were former slaves, they were in former serfdom, and they were set free. But of course, if you don't have the meanings to get a life, to run a life, be independent, you would end up in this kind of place. There were lots of other Romanians and other ethnicities who were coming to the capital, being attracted by this glamour of, oh, I might find a place to work, but of course there wasn't any, and they would end up in this kind of stuff. But one thing very interesting is that this kind of trash pit, the communists, of course, the evil communists, decided to close the trash pit and build a park above it. And this park is like literally extremely close to the city center. It's like 1.1 mile, which is like 2 or 3 kilometers at best, or around 2 kilometers. Okay, so you just
Mhm.
walk a couple of minutes and you end up from the city center. It's not like in some far, far away corner of the galaxy. No, it's like 1 mile away. Well, yeah, somehow how all these people bragging about how awesome things were before the communists came, always forget to tell you the both sides of the coin. And the cherry on the top with one of these trash pits is that at a certain point, I believe it was the kings who decided that during the winter they should level the slopes and open a ski slope. So where in the summer, spring, and autumn you would see extremely poor people searching through the trash, they decided in their magnanimous attitude to level those slopes and open them for skiing.
Yeah, so the kind of
Yeah,
stuff that like your Andrew Carnegies of the world do, where they take a tiny fraction of their immense wealth and use it to put like a vanity project in the middle of some like low income neighborhood, or for instance, and that just displaces a bunch of people, and then only the people who have appropriate funding can even afford to be patrons at that institution. That kind of thing. Is that
yep.
similar to what we're seeing here with the massive wealth inequality just taking root and destroying people's what little people have within the city and forcing them elsewhere? And we see the same thing in I don't know if it's as bad in Eastern Europe, but in the U.S., you regularly see, uh, like for instance, highway infrastructure is planned through thousands of low-income people's neighborhoods, and you end up with, and this is especially bad in Los Angeles, where roughly I think 13,000 homes had to be bulldozed, and this was during the 60s and 70s when I-5 and its auxiliary highways were being constructed. Um, they bulldozed multiple blocks of low-income neighborhoods, and then the people who were left there after that construction was complete, they're right by a giant highway now, so they have noise pollution, and noise pollution is correlated with a few major long-term health problems. Because noise pollution interrupts your sleep cycle. It makes the sleep that you do get less beneficial because you're interrupted out of REM and into less deep types of sleep by sirens and horns and just the noise caused by cars driving on roads. So this is a pretty common pattern, I think, where people just end up getting displaced for nonsense reasons that on the surface are have the aesthetic of being philanthropic or beneficial to society in some way. But when you dig down into the nitty gritty of it, when you dig down into, okay, who's going to be affected in what ways, oftentimes you find that that's just not, it's just not the case that it's beneficial in um, almost any way, except for upper income people who can now, in the case of a highway being uh, used to bulldoze thousands of low income neighborhoods, they just that the only people who are benefiting from that are those who can afford to have the vehicular transit, and who can afford homes away from that kind of pollution, that low uh, health outcomes environment. So yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not surprised that I'm not surprised at all that Bucharest has been through this kind of nonsense, and especially during the late feudal period.
Well, this is something that you can easily encounter in other cities, not only in Romania. You can see this kind of behavior almost everywhere else. Less in Western Europe because they went through these stages of urban development with this kind of problem like hundreds of years ago. But that's a different story.
Right. I mean,
They had
the early
the
industrial period was instrumental in getting basic services up and running in those first few places. So, yeah,
yeah, and they had also had the resources to do it faster and earlier, which is not
right.
comparable to the context of Eastern Europe.
Right,
But
because Romania
um,
wasn't an imperial power or anything. Their productive capacity was what they could produce locally at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
yes, Yes, it's the same idea pretty much with any stuff. Poland, Bulgaria, it's not really as much as of a difference. But what I wanted to ask you is, seeing this kind of context where you have a city center which is awesome, it looks brand new, it's a pleasure to take a walk on those streets and look at the window to do some window shopping because you cannot afford what's in them. How was the city in your average bigger city in the USA, and how much of a difference can we see between the city center and not necessarily the suburb, but the other neighborhoods?
Right. So the US is a little bit different because a lot of the and I touched on this a little bit earlier, where basically it's a shorter time period in history. So the kinds of development that have taken place are a little bit different. But to kind of take the route of performing kind of this historical analysis, um, yeah, back before the 1950s, most major cities in the US were livable in some respect. Now, this is in large part because the buildings in the city centers were multi-purpose. They were. This is before zoning law really took hold, and we'll touch on zoning law as we go forward here, I suspect. But yeah, you
Uh,
could.
As a, as a thing, I wanted to ask you that because the I believe, in my opinion, the U.S. city before the suburb got through. I know that suburbs in some areas took a hold pretty early on, but I would place the suburbs as exploding starting after the Second World War. That's why I'm trying
Right.
to see the difference between before and after.
Yeah, so the differences really started to show up during the Eisenhower administration. This is when zoning law really started to take hold because the primary motivation for zoning law is an altruistic one. Um, and namely, you want to get the polluting industry away from where people are living and doing commerce and whatnot. If you're familiar with the kinds of smog events that have occurred in cities like New York, Los Angeles, um, Houston, Chicago, these are events that cause major long-term health problems. COPD, lung cancer, bronchitis, asthma. Uh, so and like you're also, this early industry. This is before the EPA. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, started under the Nixon administration in the early 70s. The zoning law and urban planning that more so took hold during the Eisenhower administration in the early to mid 50s. This is when suburbia started to become a real force in local planning in the U.S. And the planning itself hasn't really deviated from that at all since. Like the kinds of recommendations for road construction, for building codes, setback codes, for instance, these have changed bits and pieces here and there, and it differs from state to state and from municipality to municipality. But in general, um, these kinds of requirements really did get started in the mid-century. Now, my contention, well, what we're seeing from that though is the zoning law that was established has been overzealous. So, to take New York City as an example, I've got this pulled up on, if you don't mind me sharing
Yes,
my screen
yes, yes,
briefly.
yes, of course. I will close my do
Okay,
share. I will close mine and
let's see. Let's see if this works. Is that working?
1 second. Yeah, I'll have to activate it
Okay.
because
Okay. Are we good? Yes. Okay. Cool. So what we're looking at here is a zoning map for New York City, and so some of the colors here you can see the residence districts are yellow. So when you're talking like residence district, that primarily means single family housing, unless it's grandfathered in due to prior infrastructure. Now, New York is one of the older cities in the U.S., so a lot of the buildings that you have here are on these smaller streets, and they're multi-story. It's a very densely packed. Well, not as densely packed. Well, it's not the most densely packed city in the U.S., but and the U.S. cities are less densely packed population-wise than most urban centers in the world, just because of how car dependent they all are. But anyway, New York is one, especially towards downtown. It's a little more cramped. So as you can see, these zoning these apply to buildings that are like anywhere from 3 to over 20 stories tall, and they're kind of on the older side. Building codes are not up to date. You have issues with like asbestos and AC missing, and the water isn't clean, and you got structural problems on many of these buildings. But anyway, the zoning pattern, as you can see here, you've just got these giant uninterrupted chunks of living space, and then you've got like a couple manufacturing districts. You've got a few parks scattered here and there. New York is better on parks than most cities in the U.S. are, just because, again, these parks were established before um, the kind of modern urban planning from the 50s onwards really took hold. So you've got a few of those. But notice that the commercial sectors are relegated to these little areas, like here and there, just really thin. Some, in many cases, blocks away from housing in general. And most of these roads are designed for cars. So when you're going through these districts, you've got a lot of traffic that you have to contend with, a lot of physical pollution, a lot of noise pollution, and in many cases, the last mile problem, which is this problem in urban planning of, okay, how do you get people from the nearest train station or bus stop or bike share or whatever, get them that last mile from those locations to their homes. And that problem, you can see it manifest in spades, especially like over here on the west side of the city, where it's just residential as far as the eye can see, with these labyrinth like road networks between the nearest housing and any businesses of any kind. So the urban planning, the zoning law policy that we saw emerge from the 50s was a total overzealous separation of building and land uses. In the U.S., the typical pattern, which again you can see here, is that the residential is separate from commercial, which means that you can't have the kinds of buildings that you have in Bucharest or Western Europe or the Netherlands or whatever, where you have like a multi-purpose thing going on with shops and offices on the ground floor or the first 2 floors, and then residents above that. That's not allowed anymore. It's grandfathered in the older parts of the city, as you can see here. Well, maybe I don't know if it's very clear here, but yeah, the older buildings are grandfathered into this, but all the new developments, especially you go out to the east here, it's just residential as far as the eye can see, just an ocean of yellow. And yeah,
Okay, so
that dependence on vehicular transit has caused some of the worst traffic in the world, if not the worst. I'm not sure if there's countries that have done it urban planning worse than the U.S. I think Australia may have, but anyway, so yeah, and
yeah, what I
this
wanted
differs from the urban
to
planning in Europe, because in many places in Europe, I'm not sure how exactly it works in Eastern Europe. And that was going to be my next question: is like, do you have this kind of overzealous separation of uses in your building design and your and whatnot?
um,
Sorry if I rambled there a little
no,
bit.
no problem. It's totally okay. You're on on point and making sense. The thing is, in Eastern Europe, we had this planning from the times of the communists. We have to give props also to the kings. They tried to implement some sort of measures with regard of what type of buildings should go where, but they didn't to make any great efforts. They were, of course, the wars and stuff. Not much was accomplished under
Right.
the kings. Okay, but after that, the communists came to power and they said, yeah, we should really separate. And what would be living quarters should be mainly for living. And in the primary design, yes, the living quarters were only just that living quarters, a pack, a block, a district of only blocks of apartments, and at the end of each of this, or only at the street, in the blocks facing the street, you'd have shops at the ground level. Okay, so yes,
Hmm.
that kind of stuff, and of course, the industry was totally outside of the city limits. Okay,
Yeah.
so that would
To
be
give credit where it is due, almost everywhere that zoning law was established, they did manage to get the industry out of the some of the neighborhoods. You know, the low income neighborhoods are still heavily impacted by pollution and runoff and all that. You know, and that applies to pretty much everywhere in the U.S. But um, the zoning law did manage to cut down on the emissions related mortalities. The emissions related mortality by multiple hundreds of thousands of people uh, on an annual basis. So that aspect of it has been successful. So just want to say that it's not all horrendous. It's just mostly horrendous.
oh, absolutely. But just a question which might seem a bit grim. If you have this amount of people who dies, and of course, if they are dead, you don't have to worry about housing them. If you move out like you did like people did in the USA, you move out the polluting factories, and those people wouldn't die, and that is a good thing. Uh, how do you deal with the housing? Because ultimately, you'd have more people living in the same amount of housing. So, where is the how do you solve? Because
So
the amount of houses is limited, and of course, then you would have a bit higher density of uh, people per square whatever feet meters.
right. So, are you asking about how the U.S. cities went about answering that question, or are you asking more about like how do you do that just more generally?
Oh, how the US cities did? Because ultimately, I see both in the USA and in Eastern Europe, people implemented measures. But while we can say, hey, look, there are definitely good things about these measures, were they implemented specifically to prevent people from dying? And the second layer would be you would still have a huge amount of poverty of diseases associated with poverty. Okay, how just simply moving an industry will solve all this kind of stuff, and then by having more people alive, you might end up creating more problems than solving them. The spread of disease would be the same, if not greater.
Well, to put a quirk in the population angle of this argument, a city like New York alone is roughly 20 million people strong. If you count the surrounding metropolitan area, that's 20 million people, and we're talking roughly about 1 million deaths a year nationally. So it is a large decrease in mortality, but it's not a large proportional uptick that results from that in the housing. Now, when it comes to why these cities have done what they did. As you can see, New York, and this is an exception rather than a rule, being an older city, New York has a subway system. It's an outdated subway system that doesn't that isn't nearly as expansive as it should be, given the number of people who live in New York. So that is an issue. But that is one thing that was done to try and alleviate the pressures caused by creating these large spatial gaps between worker housing and industry. However, most other cities in the U.S., their answer to this question has been just force everyone to have cars by making everything in the road design and the spacing of the development planning from the 50s onward, just make that into this sort of suburban sprawl. And yeah, the that has been a particularly capitalist way of looking at the problem, because the solution was essentially, okay, we're just going to pseudo privatize our development out to um like auto manufacturers and building contractors and just let them run the show. And of course, this has spawned what the book Strong Towns has called a Ponzi scheme in development, where you end up with overreaching on constructing new infrastructure and then not having the funds necessary to perform regular maintenance that is going to become due years down the road. So the way that's financed is just by taking out more monetary expenditures to produce more sprawl in a never-ending cycle. So the the if I were to give a grade to the response that the U.S. has done to the needs brought about by heavy industry and by light industry, is probably close to like a D or a D minus, maybe.
They
You want to
get
talk
the
more?
D.
Yeah, yeah. You want to talk more specifically about like the kinds of transit and services that are available,
Yeah,
or like
just want to touch upon something, because I see people from the government, of course, to officials trying to implement some measures which are designed, at least if we look at them at the first glance, they are designed to help the people. And we can definitely see by moving the industry outside of the city, the conditions improve. But ultimately, in just a couple of decades, I can also see that the cities start focusing not necessarily exclusively, but at a high degree in building suburbs. And somehow, by doing both, they are failing at both. Like you said, by building suburbs, they literally Ponzi scheme and they hide the costs when they pitch the discourse, or the constructor investors are hand in hand with the government, and
right,
thus they can better hide the costs of those projects, the real
right,
cost,
because
and
those
down the
costs
road
aren't. Yeah, because those costs won't be visible for anywhere from 15 to 25 years.
yeah, exactly. After two or yeah, 1, 2, but usually 2 decades, you'll see ever increasing costs, and those things prove to be money pits. So while we can say, yeah, the government of New York, the city hall, city leadership and stuff, cared for the people. You don't really see that much in effect, because you can
Oh, I
see
don't
this
agree
measure.
that they cared about anyone but their bottom line, but that's another point entirely.
Yeah, definitely. But this is sort of a point that needs to be made, because ultimately, like in the case of Eastern Europe, you can point out that yes, the kings did implement certain things, but like what is the amount of the difference between what they implemented and what they failed to implement, and they never touched upon those topics. Okay, so in seeing the difference, then we can move to the next stage, like after the 50s, when the communists came to power and they tried to implement this kind of living neighborhoods just for living and sleeping, and everything was in 5 or 10 minutes walk. and a good chunk of public transport, even subways and stuff, and how that positively impacted the lives of your average citizen versus what happens in the US.
Right. So a large part of the issue is that the industry was moved such that the novel developments would be free of the pollution and the effects that you get from having industry near housing. There were no efforts made to uh, have provisions in place for alleviating those kinds of emissions, at least for a very long time, and even today, it's still a major issue. Um, the low income neighborhoods inside of cities had basically the idea was okay, abandon the city center. We're going to use that for commerce and business, and we're going to put housing outside of that. And if you can't, and if you can't afford to leave, then you're screwed, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a position and a decision taken to which would benefit the people with money and will definitely have a negative impact if you are poor or poorer. You don't have money, screw you, stay in the projects or
Yeah,
something.
stay in those poor neighborhoods, the ghettos and the downtown dilapidated buildings that are now falling apart because no one has money to service them. And see, this is the issue though, is that like when the American city planners decided, well, when the various city councils and state governments and whoever was involved in all of the legal shenanigans going into creating this kind of environment, um, there were no considerations made for low income people in the slightest, and that has led to the in large part the abysmal situation you have now, where cities towards the downtown city centers are just falling apart, and then the infrastructure servicing the surroundings are also falling apart because the abandonment of the city center was deliberate, and the those urban funds were allocated towards constructing this never-ending suburban sprawl. And that's where all of that has to go now because it's been around long enough that you've got a steady stream of infrastructure maintenance obligations that are all coming due constantly. And once the city entered this debt cycle, once the city enters this debt cycle, there's not a lot it can do to get out of that. And this is an issue that is unique to the US and Australia and New Zealand and the UK and Canada. Um, like if you were to compare and contrast with a European city, which whose downtown wasn't entirely abandoned, like after the protests, for instance, in the Netherlands, uh, to avoid the transformation of the city into this car dependent mess. Uh, those protests succeeded, and from the 70s onwards to today, um, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Well,
It's okay, take your time. But let me share my screen because I
yeah, sure, go ahead.
somehow
I'm done sharing this.
somehow I agree and somehow I disagree with what you said. There are plenty of cities in Eastern Europe which are plagued by this public transport, not public transport, by the transport issue, and mainly the it has to do with what happened after the fall of the communist regimes in the 90s. The population of a city, let's say Bucharest, it had like in the early 1900s, you can speak about 1 million, give or take, usually a bit less. Early
Hmm.
50s, you would have 1.5 million. Late 80s, you would have 2 and some million, and now in present day, you'd have 2.5 and 3, including all the new suburbs being built around, like insanely highly dense areas. And early in the communist regime, you'd like right now we have a city which was built for, let's say, 500,000 cars. It's just a number I pulled from thin air,
Hmm.
housing 1 million, between 1 and 2 million people. But let's say 500,000 cars, and now you have like almost twice the population, and definitely twice, if not 3 times, the amount of cars. So definitely those are not streets built to handle this much amount of traffic, and of course there is noise pollution and all the problems you've mentioned earlier. So that would be an issue impacting also the Eastern Europe cities. But I was looking after urban planning in communist countries, and of course I said, well, let's see what Wikipedia says. And the first sentence: urban planning in the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War era was dictated by ideological, political, social, as well as economic motives. And I was like, hey, but I don't see a problem with that. Like, okay, ideological and
That's
political, like
always
what?
true,
Yeah, but
regardless of the country.
yeah, exactly. And we can have opinions, different opinions on the ideological and political stuff. But shouldn't you build cities based on social and economic motives? Like, please show me a city which isn't built like this. Yeah,
Right,
lots of
right.
lots of BS from the very first sentence. Oh yeah, and what I
So,
was
one of the questions that I wanted to kind of delve into next was, I've done some reading on the history of the Eastern European urban development. I had a My question was, how exactly did the microrayon um, come about, and how did it evolve? Like, I guess this would be a good discussion point to lead into. But how did the microrayon begin? How did it evolve, and how did it manifest in like the different countries in the Eastern European region? Because each each location, I'm sure, has its own local flavor of variety that was put into that kind of development plan.
okay. That's a very heavy question. That definitely needs its own episode. But the general thing is, if you search through Marxist-Leninist literature, you won't directly find the, I don't know, fourth book of Marx, his fifth chapter or something, in which he dedicates an entire chapter of how people should be housed or something like that. It's mostly economical theory. Tangentially, it touches upon this kind of topic, but the main thinkers were more worried and more concerned with the economic aspects than with the everyday living. Okay, so you find very few, if any, but definitely when you decide to say, hey, we need to build socialism, we need to build communism, we need to build a better country, and thus we need to build factories, of course, the problem of housing people
Right.
arises.
Especially
And
when those factories are close by worker housing.
yes, and in the early years, from what I have found, the Soviet people, because they were starting it way earlier than the other Eastern European countries, came up with 2 or 3 ideas. There were like 2, 3 general currents of thinking, and they kind of try to get inspiration from what was already happening and what was already said, drawn in the West. And in the West, we had the case, I believe this is Garden City movement. And this is one type of town which was brought up late 1800s. And it was even a case in which they tried to implement this kind of structure of a city. Okay, to have a sort of a central city with administration and part of the population, then to connect it with another center, and then have a place of leisure. Okay, so you have this concept being around, and you have other sort of utopian cities and stuff, how to build a better cities. But from those, that was the Western stuff. And then there were other currents, one in which you'd simply put huge blocks of apartments very close to a factory, and then you would house everybody into sort of communal housing, and of course with a place where everybody could eat, a cantina. So that would later devolve into somehow into a comunalka, a huge building in which multiple families would live. But the basic idea was a bit a bit more extreme. It was simply a huge building block with lots of people, maybe single individuals in single room, and of course multiple individuals slash families in multiple rooms, in sort of mini apartments. That would be one.
Right.
The other very proeminent, and it was a bit of back and forth, was proposing to have a big city, a big administrative center, so to say, and a factory. And between these 2 points, you would have a road, and along that road to put these houses, and you would have everything stretched on one side and the other of the road. If you are familiar with present day, I believe Dubai or some Arab prince is trying to do this kind of very long stretch city with the blocks, apartments, and any other amenities put on one side or the other, and then you would have public transport going from point A to point B, collecting all those people. So early on, there were like 2 or 3 concepts, but ultimately they didn't have much success because there were pros and cons, and people needed better and better conditions and education, access to healthcare and stuff like that. And they decided to come up with the microrayon. And microrayon, let me see if I find a map, would be sort of yeah, this would be the early version of a microrayon. A bunch of blocks with apartments. In the middle, you would have parks, because it's nice to have a mini park, football field or something. And everywhere around, you should have shops, food shops, clothes, the things for
Pharmacies,
schools.
schools.
Yeah, exactly. And definitely everything should have been in like 10 or 15 minutes walking distance from your
Right.
home, including hospital, healthcare, maybe theaters, cinemas, and stuff like that. So that would be how they would look
And the
before the.
characteristic size of a microrayon, I think, was like 1,500 meters square usually in that ballpark.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
and it varies depending on the stage of development. It
of course.
does vary.
So when
So,
did
yeah.
I know the microrayon really started. Well, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it started during the Stalin era, from the 30s into the 50s in Russia. I don't know, however, when it started elsewhere in Eastern Europe. So you can probably shed some light on that.
In the general Eastern Bloc, of course, it started after the Second World War, and you take the end of the Second World War, you add 5 or 10 years, depending on the local situation, and then you can talk about this kind of urban planning being spread in the other countries. So let's say 50s and 60s. It'd be,
Okay. Yeah, that makes
um,
sense.
yeah, and here, like, there is this thing that needs to be mentioned. Lots of people present they complain about the conditions of this how these apartments provided by these apartments, and what they usually fail to tell you. I have to make a sort of response video to someone who was is a there is another YouTuber. He was living in Soviet Union for a couple of decades, got into one of these apartments, then in the 90s moved to the USA. And in one of his video, he talks about, are you familiar with square meters?
Hmm.
Okay, but I believe the conversion is like 10, 11 feet to
I
something.
think in metric, it's fine.
Oh, okay. So usually this kind of apartment would have anywhere from 30 square meters to 50 square meters, and
Hmm.
of course you would have some larger apartments, but that would be a thing only in later decades. And for example, in the case of Bucharest, most of these apartments would be heated up in the winter by steam, using the steam from the local factories, because they would
Mm.
have heavy machineries being powered up by steam.
So
You
they
would
would
have
route the waste heat to the housing?
yep. Then that
Okay.
was an awesome idea, which worked perfectly well. Problem is after when the city started to go above a certain population limit, the amount of steam available and the length of the network of pipes and the maintenance and so on and so forth
That quickly becomes
became,
unsustainable and insufficient. Right. Okay.
yeah, exactly. And that's why you hear all these problems and issues in the 80s. Okay, they were real, they happened. But my thing
Hmm.
with this person doing videos about the Soviet Union is that he is complaining about his 50 square meter apartment. Like, okay, it could have been problematic because in some cases you would find uh, three, four, five people living in this two-room, three-room, 50 square meter, which is
Right.
gets pretty cramped and horrible, borderline horrible.
I
But
know that
he
during
says,
the sorry,
yeah, yeah,
I don't want to
go ahead.
interrupt. Yeah, so I know that the population that had to live under these conditions did increase tremendously as people went from the late feudal agrarian lifestyle to a more urban lifestyle, and there were some adaptation problems with that. And then when it comes like the apartment size, I see why that could be an issue, but that's only if you're indoors all day. That's only if you're at home all day. Like um in this kind of urban planning, to my understanding, the idea is your apartment, your domicile is where you eat and sleep at the end of the day. Not a lot else. You do most of your day-to-day living outside of that space. You do it in the city, in the factory, going between them and interacting with people outside of your particular little space for yourself. So, was that
Yeah,
kind of
yes, yes, you are correct. That was the type of mentality. And my issue would be, hey, it isn't the most flattering, but at least they were honest. Hey, we expect you to be in this factory for at least 8 hours a day, plus whatever commuting time. But then you have very little time to spend in your apartment, and that's that. But it's the same thing in the capitalist
right?
regimes, which are
Exactly.
supposedly much better, but they are not as brutal in their honest. They are never honest. They don't tell you, hey, we will do exactly the same thing and give you the lesser amount of space sometime.
Right. And then, of course, it's more expensive to live in the US anyway. Now, when it comes to the building design. I know there was also some issues going through like the 50s and 60s where the building design for the microRAM was a bit over standardized. For instance, out in the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, where the winters are a lot harsher because it's a continental polar air mass as opposed to a maritime polar air mass. The temperatures can drop far below what they would elsewhere in across Eurasia. So the building insulation just wasn't adequate in those cases, and that's just a mistake that had to be learned from. And also, kind of the overstandardization of the design of the building also was, to my understanding, an issue. However, now I remember what I was going to say. This is not a one-to-one comparison. It's like apples and oranges between the capitalist regimes in Western Europe and the US and Eastern Europe, which, as you mentioned, very eloquently, they were stuck in this late feudal epoch for a long time in the early 20th century, as opposed to the capitalist regimes, which were these imperialist nation states, which were able to set up an appropriate supply chains of raw materials from other locations like South America, Africa, South Asia, for a very long time leading into the 20th century. So it's not really a fair comparison because Romania and the USSR and Bulgaria, Poland, these were going from a late feudal, war-ravaged status quo to a modern form of development, and they were able to do so very quickly. But it's not realistic. It's just not realistic to expect that everyone's going to have like their own giant, sprawling apartment with all the best amenities that technology can offer. It's a very practical, down to earth mindset of, okay, we're going to march forward into modernity step by step, and it's not going to happen all at once. And you see that right now with the similar complaints from you see that same kind of circumstantial blindness from people who blanket criticize Chinese housing strategy for many of the same reasons, when again it's not a one-to-one comparison. Most of China was lifted out of this very deep systemic poverty not that long ago. It's a very new feudalist, new agrarian environment, and that only recently has started to unravel. So in the same way that you have that happening in in the PRC now, the same thing had to happen in the Eastern Europe and in the Soviet bloc. They were starting from nothing, from ground zero, and this was an idea that did work to some extent to alleviate those symptoms of just abject underdeveloped poverty.
Yeah, definitely. And we can see a huge amount of population being displaced from rural areas and being moved into this type of new cities, because they were literally brand new cities. And that worked for a while, but after a while, you quickly catch up with the limits of the system.
Right.
And yeah, that was the point I was making about this person making YouTube videos comparing lamely, in my opinion, Soviet Union with America. I said, hey, here in Soviet Union, I had access to these 50 square meter apartments, but then I moved to the USA and I lived in a 200 square meter, 4 times bigger apartment or house or something. And I was like, dude, come on. Like, are you telling me that everybody in the USA is living in a 200 square meter apartment or
Yeah.
house? Like,
I don't think I
and
could live in one of those.
yeah, exactly. And on the other side, he was talking about waiting lists that you had to wait for a period of time. And I started asking myself, hey, what if the Soviet Union leadership, the ghost of Stalin and stuff, said, hey, you know what, you shouldn't give people 50 square meter apartments, you should give them 200 square meters apartments. Okay, how would that have gone? Because ultimately it's just a 4x difference. you need an amount of space four times higher, but
Another thing to
ultimately
note,
it's the
another
math is just
sorry,
not simple.
yeah,
It's like way too
it's very
complex.
non-trivial.
Yeah, exactly, and
When you want to
you'd need
expand
the
space, that means you have to expand everything around that as well, which costs a lot of material expenditure to make that happen. And then, yeah,
proposing that you have still the necessary amount of workforce and the resources, and everything needs to be delayed like endlessly. So it wasn't a realistic option to.
yeah, and there are some legitimate critiques too. Like the Eastern Bloc did have this sort of overfocus on heavy industry later on in its lifetime. There wasn't enough light industry to service what kinds of the kind of modern living conditions that people were looking for. You know, appliances and technology later on. You know, just stuff like that, stuff that makes your life easier bit by bit. That was under focused, but that's not like a fatal flaw or anything. Again, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc started from scratch. They had to, yeah, and
They
those
had to
early
catch up.
systems, of course,
They
they're
had
going
to
to have
catch up
plenty of limitations.
very fast. Mhm. Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. Yeah, there were plenty of limitations to those systems, and there are plenty of legitimate critiques that we can apply to them. For instance, if we were to just take the microrayon as it was designed back in the day, that wouldn't be financially solvent, given that was part of the issue that Soviet Union faced. And if I'm wrong, feel free to jump in and correct me. Um, but part of the issue was there was too much atomization to the social services that were available. You know, having multiple schools and pharmacies and uh, um, hospitals and whatnot. That's all very good, but having multiple of those per microrayon, that's just not a smart distribution of materials, of the resources that you have available. However, I'll caveat this by saying that back then there wasn't the technology, or there wasn't a wide implementation of the technology used in like light rail public transit, in bike infrastructure and whatnot. That is more recent. So walking was most people's mode of transit back in the day. Uh, that has changed now. So you can take the idea of the microrayon and kind of scale it up to maybe more 10 square kilometers a piece type thing, and have it be more ad hoc. Because like if you have appropriate provisions for public transit, then you're not going to need this grid like breakdown of where people live, and that'll allow for more centralization of public services like hospitals, schools, utilities, medical dispensaries, and all that stuff into smaller, well, not smaller, but fewer buildings. And then you've got a smaller amount of infrastructure necessary because you have fewer buildings to that effect. Um, so that would be one way to alleviate the financial stresses placed on city management by the model of the microrayon. Um, but I'd say it was a really successful first attempt at a livable city. You know, coming out of that, like coming out of the wars and the economic devastation before that, and the social upheavals that have been building up to all of this, even since before then as well. You know, again, it was a situation where feudalism was still hanging on, so it's a very non-trivial issue to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. I sort of pretty much agree with what you say. There are, for example, like two issues And one of those issues might be that um, people tend to forget living standards in the 50s and 70s weren't really living standards. Like you don't speak about the like present day. We can talk about a certain amount of insulation that you need and the insulation efficiency and heating rendement and stuff like that.
The
But
water
you
cleanliness standards and all that
exactly.
stuff.
But yeah, but those things weren't really a thing in the 50s and 70s, not barely maybe 70s, 80s, and they were just starting to take hold, not to exempt the architects and the leadership of that time of their faults and shortcomings, but
Of
literally
course.
that was the first time, the 1900s was the first time when we literally were faced with the idea of having big cities, big modern concrete cities, and how we need to improve them, both in the quality of living and then accessibility, like you said. And I don't think that we need to rebuild the cities because ultimately they are money pits, both the Eastern
Yeah.
European model and
They're
as
not
well
only
as
money pits, they're also material pits because I don't know if you're familiar with this issue, but it's a relatively obscure issue right now. But the concrete that is used in building construction, in road construction, and sidewalk construction, and just urban construction in general, that kind of cement comes from a very specific type of sand. You have to have a specific grain size range, and that is only obtainable on coastlines and on freshwater river bottoms, and the over extraction and use of these types of sand has led to this low key issue now where there is a global shortage of concrete grade sand, and it's also led to mass environmental destruction, freshwater marine life, for instance. That's another auxiliary issue due to this is all the pollution caused by concrete grade sand extraction. And if we're going to build cities to be not only livable but also sustainable in the long term, we need to find alternatives and ways around this massive problem of just running out of sand to dredge up and also running out of ecosystems to have that sand in the first place.
There are multiple cases in right now happening in India where huge amounts of
India,
riverbed,
China,
yeah,
Myanmar,
being
yeah, all
destroyed
over
by
there.
this exactly this phenomenon you've mentioned. And as
South
far as I
America too.
know, for example, a thing that wasn't happening back in before the 90s, right now Europe is imposing a rule to reuse concrete in low level in buildings with a small, not high buildings, Jesus, and in a sort of roads, pavements, and stuff like that to reuse for between 20, 30, up to 40%, I believe, of the
Okay.
concrete and of the stones, and that's being done properly implemented in Germany in law and code, and I believe there are other countries who are slowly catching up and trying to say, hey, you've demolished the building, yeah, please reuse the concrete in non-essential non-structural type of situations, and there are plenty of places where you can reuse that concrete, mix it with new concrete, new cement, and build whatever pavement and stuff you need without
Right.
sacrificing quality. But yeah, we this is another thing that we need to be aware. uh, 50s and 70s, literally, if we compare the living standard in these two cliche two-room apartment, 50 square meter, Eastern European Soviet style
The
accommodation with whatever was
Brezhnevkas and the Khrushchevkas and all those.
exactly, yeah, and we compare the living conditions and what you had available, and I would think this is another point that we should discuss in a future episode, the accessibility of it, because ultimately you would pay for renting such an apartment from the state somewhere around 5% of your income to
Mhm.
whatever was available in UK, in other European, West European countries, and even in USA. There is a huge difference in the quality and affordability.
Right. Yeah, and
I don't-
all of the accessibility as well, and yeah, that's part of the issue is that because housing costs are exorbitantly high in both the U.S. and in Western Europe, and I'll throw Australia and New Zealand in there too. They're also not stellar at this, and a large part of that is just because of the model of housing that is used in these nations is one where it is privatized. It's not like housing is not seen as a right or as something that is desirable to give to people. And as a result of that, you have very inefficient housing allocation provisions in place. If I'm not mistaken, there were some measures taken in the Soviet bloc for people to move from their kind of late feudal agrarian lifestyle to urban centers. What? I guess my question would be: how was this modernization handled from the perspective of someone moving from that countryside to these cities? Like, what kinds of issues and adaptation uh, barriers kind of presented themselves?
Wow, that's an awesome question and allows me to get into the meat of the matter.
All right.
Usually, from present day time, with our modern day view and understanding of how life goes, we can look back in time and say, "Hey, look, that was a population displacement," and partially that is absolutely correct. It was a population displacement in huge amount quantities to move all those insanely high number of people from rural to urban areas. Usually, you end up with cities like 100,000 large, 300,000 large, 500,000, and those were people who were previously in rural environments. And
Right. So it's a lot lower density and there's more room for them to spread their stuff out. Is it true that like a lot of I've seen this, I don't know how true it is, but I've heard that a lot of people who were previously farmers brought their animals with them to these newly designed urban environments, and because there weren't provisions for farm animals, that became a problem of just a sanitation issue, more or
yes,
less.
there are such instances when that happened. Uh, of course, the leadership took care of that, and what you end up was having not necessarily living chicken for from small chicken just barely gotten out of the egg up to mature chicken. But what you end up having in later dates is that you would bring from your countryside relatives, or you would buy from someone with relatives in the countryside and connection in that kind of a place. You would buy live chicken, and you wouldn't have time to cut their necks or stuff like that instantly, and you would kind of keep them alive for mostly couple of days in your balcony and before killing them, and that would be sort of like hey. But it wasn't necessary the rule in later years. But the thing is, here you have like a process which involves the population at large, and that was their way of living. Everybody was being set up and concentrated in the rural areas, and then you take a good chunk of that population and you move them in the urban areas. And of course, there are critics saying that you sort of destroy the family connections and you make them harder, and there are sort of values which aren't being transmitted from father to sons, mother daughters, the family unit fabric and
Just like a
social
general
fabric is.
class of cultural arguments, then.
Yeah, exactly. But in the same time, I would not necessarily come against this type of arguments, but I would say, hey, look, it is true that you are not as well connected with your parents, but in the same time, if you are a young person in your 40s or 60s and you go to the city and get into a high school, then you start learning for a job, and in your early 20s you have the chance of getting a job in a workshop or whatever factory is around, and then uh, you will definitely get an accommodation of your own, and that gives you space and time for yourself regardless of how small, and that is not your property, not your private property, but it's for your personal use, and you have personal space, and you can have your books, and you can study in your own privacy, have learn to do your own stuff and become independent, and of course start a family and stuff. And this is a way of starting a family and a level of independence which was definitely not able if you were stuck in the same type of familial home with your parents and grandparents and all the relatives running around you, and not to even mention how hard and almost impossible was to study before this kind of displacement, this kind of change of regime
And
was
even then,
happening.
you can have your babushka move into the apartment nearby to you, even, and you can still connect and all that. So, if do you mind if I touch on that a little bit, the social
Yeah,
aspect
sure,
of it
sure.
all? So,
Let's get into it.
yeah. So the commentary that I have on this is that anytime you introduce a macro scale change to the structure of a set of social networks, people are embedded in those networks are going to, for good reason, be skeptical of that change. And this is a manifestation of risk aversion. People are unfamiliar with, and therefore hesitant to adopt these kinds of social changes. What I would say though is that, like, if we were talking with someone, because that kind of risk aversion always exists. People are always going to be afraid of change. Um, if we're talking to someone today though and pitching the idea of, okay, we're going to take, um, basically, we're going to give you the ability to move from this multi-generational ancestral home of yours into this wider social arena, yes, you will have the bonds with your families will probably weaken at least a little bit. However, when you are in that kind of communal environment, you're building novel social connections with your work friends, with your study mates, with your professors, and your neighbors, and the people who run the shops downstairs, and you end up building a new web of social connections that um, take the place of those older ones. And because you're living in an environment where there are more people to interact with and in more dynamical ways, your social agency, and by extension your economic agency, increases substantially. You're able to be more independent in the sense that you are able to rely on this mass interconnected web of humanity that lives in this city and is connected with one another and can support one another in times of need and crisis, which that just happens all the time. So I guess the thing to stress here would be, don't be afraid of letting yourself experience new social systems, of experiencing new social connections, and it's just a case of, at
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, it you will have stronger social connections than before. You'll have more numerous social connections than before, and there'll be new opportunities that come along with those. So, like, I get the hesitation, but as long as it's presented in this way, I think that that would make the transition easier for some people. And I feel like when when the Soviet nations went about with their modernization projects applied to urban spaces, um, there were a lot of good provisions made for this, namely that people were living together, more or less, interacting with one another in interesting ways. But yeah, and there were also some issues that came along with that experiment. With any trial of any given system of law or governance or urban planning or whatever, there's going to be problems that crop up. You can't predict all of the problems. That's like trying to predict a black swan breakthrough in some field of technology. It's not going to happen. So you have to synthesize novel iterations of these modes of development and planning as you go along. Um, how
Yeah.
well do you think the Soviet bloc managed to do that? How well do you think they adapted to the pressures they encountered as they implemented these systems of modern governance and planning?
Well, I believe this can be easily, and also let's tie it with what you said earlier. Um, we kind of have this problem from two perspectives. Like, if we are talking about the Soviet Union and what they did to their population, because usually this is a type of narrative, oh, so evil communists forced people to move from their countryside to the cities to work in the factories. Yes, but the capitalist system is doing literally exactly the same, and the capitalists don't give you a choice, just like the Soviets didn't give a choice. Okay, so this is a false uh, issue to bring up. But this is the thing. There is a thing which happened, and there is another thing which we are doing like today, and we sort of tend to mix and confuse one with another. And when we are thinking about a choice, which now today we might have, knowing the lessons of the past, we definitely have a choice present day for our future actions. But most of the things happening in the 50s and earlier and after the 50s, people didn't have a choice and weren't given a choice, and also they didn't have a choice and weren't being given a choice under the capitalist regime. So this is
Exactly.
a
They never
false.
had a choice in the beginning. If anything, the like freedom to do stuff comes along with development, but that development has to happen first.
Yeah, exactly. And it's good that we separate these two and don't fault like present day and future thinking and planning and or examining our choices with something that you couldn't do in the past. Because what would you gonna do to go and say, hey, dear Soviet communist leader, I'm not gonna move to the city and educate myself and work in the factory? Or dear capitalist Jeff Bezos, I'm just gonna starve to death and not work in your Amazon warehouse? Like, that's that's not an issue. But the thing is, to answer your question, one point, the Soviet system had the communist regimes implemented this kind of change, the policies which led to this kind of change, but I don't think they were properly aware of the consequences of that, because sociology was there but was not that complex of a science. And again, they were trying to better things as they progressed. But ultimately, if you have a city going from 1 million to 2 million, you that is a change and an increase in population that you can manage and you can understand. But after that, I believe that no matter how much and how small of a amount of population you bring to the city, or you displaced from the rural areas to the city, you won't be able to calculate the complexity of the possible issues that you will encounter will increase exponentially. so you will not be able to properly track. But the thing is, with all its sort of faults, there were plenty of people who kept in touch with their relatives in their countryside and would go there like weekly or monthly or have a
Right.
trade and engage. So they weren't like properly and totally disconnected, and they had the choice to do that. It was harder because you would
Wasn't it
work
the case that
by.
most people who made this move went to like the nearest city, so they were so kind of close to those familial roots?
Yeah, that was the usual thing. What was also usual and very commonplace would be, for example, after you would finish high school or university, you would be sent to a far distant place for a couple of years, and then you would make a request to be brought back to your place. Either you could stay there, but also you had the option to make this request to get to the biggest city close to your house or something like that, depending on the work you are doing. And that had also good and bad impact, but usually good impact, because if you are from, I don't know, around middle of nowhere near New York, and you are being sent to another place, you have the opportunity to see that other place. If you are in construction, you can then work together with other people and build a hospital and build a school, and then you can come back to your hometown and say, hey, I built the school that will educate 1,000 people per day, and I'm proud of that thing. I have achieved that, and
Right.
I have connected with people from all over the place, from all over the country. Okay, even if it was for 1 year or was 2 years or 3 or stuff like that. So
Like
it
a
will
traveling
you
work
would
program.
yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, and in another video of mine, I was talking about how in rural parts of USA there are like huge shortages of educational personnel, like teachers and administrative shortages of doctors and nurses and stuff like that. And if you would implement this kind of program to have people who would graduate from this or that school or classes to go and work for 1 year or 2 years, being given free accommodation or just the same 5% cost accommodation, I believe plenty of people would go there, and we will see an alleviation of this kind of problems.
So I have a couple questions to kind of clarify because I haven't this isn't a lived experience that I share, so my understanding is a bit murky on this, especially given the fact that the narrative environment in the West is so toxic and polarized on how policy in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union worked when it did. So my question would be, um, how voluntary or like to what extent were these moves mandatory? Like was it like the case where you could like you can't choose that you go somewhere, but you can have a say in where you end up and what you do when you're there, right? Or how does that work in more detail, I guess?
Well, I believe, from my understanding, one consideration was that you would receive free education, even free higher education, but and sometimes you would receive free board and housing, uh,
Mhm.
accommodation near the school, and food, of course. But you would, of course, the state would calculate an amount of money which would be associated with that free housing, board, food, and clothes and whatever. And they would send you to this distant place for a couple of years, sort of to count as a repayment. You wouldn't necessarily directly pay back for the free education you got, but it was sort of accounted under that. So that was one principle uh, under they were starting implementing this kind of stuff. But then they understood that there are a huge amount of remote areas which lacked infrastructure,
Right,
either
all the way
roads.
out to like Chukotka and Magadan and all
Yeah,
way out in the east. So
Exactly, and you had small rural villages and communities, and they definitely need some kind of road, railroad, electricity, and stuff like that. And you simply couldn't gather enough people from that area. So for a period of time, almost the entire workforce was forced to engage in this type of, hey, I will go to this city and either build something, I will go to this remote village and
So this
act
was like
as
a
a
national,
nurse.
like a national, or rather a set of national development plans adopted to kickstart the industrialization of the Eastern Bloc.
Yes,
And
yes,
then this
yes.
was like
That
it was a set of social investments in that, like, okay, you'll get free education, and we understand that education is going to pay us back, and you having the skills to develop our country for us, basically. Is that
yes,
the kind of the idea?
exactly. That was what they think. Of course, they wouldn't tell
Right.
you, hey, look, we will give you free education, then you will repay us, because that wouldn't have sounded very communist. But it was definitely the sort of
Also, quick
mindset.
comment on that. That's not only a policy that communists engage in. When I was at university, I encountered many students who are on similar programs right now. For instance, China and Malaysia and the UAE and Qatar and Singapore. They all engage in this program where those governments will pay for your education abroad, and then you'll come back and you'll have a 7-year contract with the state to perform some task in alignment with the field that they paid for you to get a job in. Like in the case of the UAE or Qatar, that most of it's the oil sector, petroleum in general, and then Malaysia, for instance, it might be medical science or chemical engineering or something else. So this is a policy that I was it pioneered by the Soviets, or were they kind of seeing what worked elsewhere already at the time? Because, like, again, this isn't bounded to just the communists or communist identifying nations. Something that they did.
Well, I'm not sure about it being implemented otherwise in other places, but I believe it was a policy which started as, hey, we don't have enough educated workforce and we need to
So
rebuild
we'll
fast.
force that to be the case.
Yeah, and then it kind of evolved into something of a matter of quality, because if you have, after a decade or so, you kind of build all the necessary infrastructure to educate your people and to send
Hmm.
electricity and hospitals and stuff, and you would have your local doctors and stuff, but from time to time, if you can supply with new, freshly educated people which would somehow be better educated, even if they would not be versed in practice, they would have a better standard of education than the generation before, and then you can come up and bring and sort of have a refreshing attitude and say, hey, look, we need to implement also these standards, and we will need to be aware of this and that to ensure a better quality, not only with the things that were available like 10 20 years ago and stuff like that, and that would also have been somewhere on the mindset.
Okay. And a follow up to this would be uh what were there any appreciable differences in the way that this policy was structured between the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union proper?
Not really. The yeah, no. No, okay, I'll have to research that a bit better, but at first glance, I would say that no, not really. Also,
Okay.
Soviet Union was pretty varied in terms of they had not countries, sectors
It's
where
the
you
USSR.
regions.
There's 84
Uh,
republics in it. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have regions which would have been highly agricultural, and you'd have parts where it would be heavily sided on the industry. And of course, you'd see a lot of variation from one part to another. But
Yeah,
so
like
that's why
you're
I'm,
not gonna see the same kind of industrialization in, say, Zabaykalsky or Krasnoyarsk as you're gonna see in like Lipinsk or uh, yeah, like
yes,
toward
yes,
more
you,
towards the European side of things.
yeah.
So
But for example, even inside Ukraine. you would have areas where you would see a concentration of heavy industries and
Right.
huge swaths of land which are definite and communities which are definitely agricultural
And a lot of
organized
that is
based.
just land use policy in general, because you still need a strong agricultural base for food security reasons. So that's just
Oh,
how you have to
definitely.
go about doing it.
Yeah, and now with this kind of projects, with the educational rotation, you can have better educated students coming fresh out of the university, agricultural engineers going back to the local stations and giving fresh new input from the best technologies developed. Because we are not talking only about the early 50s and before, when the best thing was, hey, we have a better tractor and some idea of how to get better seeds. Now we can talk about the later half of the century, the 60s, the 70s, when the technology and the science was not only established but was really advancing, and there were meaningful
Right.
discoveries, and you can have this kind of transfer of knowledge at a of higher quality.
Right. Yeah, and this is again something that you see elsewhere, where you'll have agricultural policy and education that is given to people who then go back and reinvest that into improving the sustainability, stability, yields, and health of the crops back at home. So yeah, this is
Oh,
a something that's just smart to do in general.
yeah, just to throw a brick in the proverbial window, let's just imagine that instead of being forced to buy your seeds and technology from, let's say, a Monsanto type of conglomerate, you receive
Yeah.
free agricultural engineer helping you, not for free, but for a way less of a fee and with much more better, high quality information and
And with
access to the
public
resources.
domain
Exactly.
accessibility to all this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Information does not make sense as property. They it behaves differently. It's a very non-zero sum in a very strict sense. It's yeah. So having yeah, making it such that the developmental technology that you would use to modernize whatever sector of your economy that you want to modernize, whether that's agriculture or heavy industry or light industry or the service sector, any of that, you put that in the public domain, people are going to be able to use that and innovate with it. And you'll end up with a better, healthier society that is more interconnected, interdependent, and therefore which can do more things and just generally move people forward. So this is kind of what so when theorists talk about the means of production, or I guess the forces of production, um this is a very general term that refers to uh I would argue, maybe back in the 1800s, the forces of production literally meant the factories and the farms and the stuff where you take stuff and turn it into more useful stuff. But in a modern context, this would refer more to a general class of productivity, such that people don't have to deal with the more mundane parts of the economy, the more foundational parts of it. If you are able to pare down the labor time expenditures made by people in keeping the food supply steady and making sure that there's plenty of readily available steel and copper and nickel and iron ready for lighter industry purposes. And if you take that and you find ways to make it more efficient, that frees up people to do more of what they want. And this includes scientific pursuits, it includes artistic pursuits, it includes higher, like, not higher skill, but more so the professions that take longer to train for. You know, it frees your economy to pursue a more diverse range of interests, and this, I imagine, is the idea behind what was done in the Eastern Europe during the mid to late 20th century, and kind of pushing forward away from this neo-feudalist structure, you end up gaining, for a much larger swath of people, the ability to do more of what they want to do.
Yeah,
And you do that by just developing, just developing your infrastructure, developing your technology, developing what kinds of jobs people have access to,
yeah,
given that
definitely. But
technology. So yeah,
yeah. I so much agree with you. But we have to mention that this is sort of like present day concept that needs to be implemented in the upcoming years. Because ultimately, it's just my belief that, for example, Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc did talk about implementing communism and a certain type of society, but they were so busy working on implementing it that they sort of they had a huge vision, but that vision sort of fell
it
short
had a lot
because
of
they were
blind spots.
exactly, and they didn't had any of the things that we are aware today, because they accomplished a lot, but then they kind of stopped, and they needed like you were saying earlier, the means of production. There is a certain type of flavor of a means of production in the context of 1800s and early 1900s. But if we are talking today about how big the economy is structured and what is really important, like information and how information and freedom of information are manifested in present day, the means of production is sort of very highly and advanced compared to the previous understanding, and there are like, huge differences between these two. So we kind of need to restructure this kind of stuff in the present day thing. Yes, means of production, but not only tractors and hammers and
We
sickles
need
and
to
stuff like that.
recontextualize what this means, given modern
Yeah,
conditions. Yeah.
exactly.
So I guess my question going out from that kind of rambling long paragraph of a sentence then would be, okay, so we had this period of development where you had microrayons and heavy industry and just developed rail lines, communication, water sanitation, power, all the basics, and got that established. So what has happened to all of that since the Soviet era came to an end in Eastern Europe? To my understanding, it's not been a pretty picture.
Oh, definitely not. Lots of capitalists tried to. It wasn't really capitalist. It was more likely put the former Aparatsky grab a hold of those, and they entitled themselves capitalists and entrepreneur, and they control all these pieces of infrastructure, and they try to have their own private companies compete for the taxpayer dollars and stuff like that. And yeah, it's not a
Ah,
pretty picture. We've transformed
oh,
into sort of Soviet America 2.0 or something.
yeah. And when it
But
comes to the
w-
infrastructure,
mm,
I can see like the U.S. is turning into a new Russia when it comes to just how dilapidated everything is. And there are different reasons for that. In our case, it's because of the financialization of the economy and the hollowing out of our productive base to like um, other nations entirely. See, the one of the major issues that we've had since the '90s onwards has been the outsourcing of labor and production to China, to um, South Asia, South America, Africa, and that because so it's not easy to make a productive base in a country. And once you hollow it out, it takes roughly 40 to 60 years to reestablish that. Um, we were, from all the things that we were talking about today, I think it's fairly obvious that none of this happened overnight. It took decades to get the development where it is today in the, where it was at it when it was functional, quasi-functional. You get what I'm trying to say. It took a long time to establish that. It took a long time to construct microrayons and make all that heavy industry and get everything up to some approximation of modernity. Whether that was more or less successful, depends on the local flavor of administrative forcings that occurred in one place or another. But it's that production base. Once it's gone, there's not a lot you can do to get it back outside of starting from scratch, because these systems of economy are predicated on supply chains that, if you lose the first few steps in those supply chains, if you lose the capacity to maintain those first few steps in the supply chain, the general extractive and refinement steps, where you take the raw resources and turn it into actionable material that you can put into infrastructure or whatever else, really. Once that's gone, yeah, it does not return on its own. That's going to take a very long and deliberate process to rectify. So I don't think that the U.S. is in a good situation going forward. I think it's going to be very similar to what we're seeing in the Eastern European region, where it's just hollowed out more or less, and
Yeah,
that's very
but
sad to see.
sure. But if we
That's
see
the
that,
prognosis.
yeah, well, I totally agree. But if we agree that the USA is facing a crisis, for example, in terms of infrastructure, we can both agree that that is indeed a problem, but it's also the chance of an awesome opportunity to rebuild that, not on infrastructure, that is just an example, to rebuild that
Yeah,
way better and with much consideration and with plenty of the lessons learned from the experience before us, and have a greater quality of anything, even either we are talking about personal life or how the govern us. But we can implement. We have a crisis. The problem is, are we up and able to take advantage of that crisis and make things better, or that crisis
exactly.
will gonna run over us like a steamroll?
Exactly. And we are at I would say we're at a crossroads, but honestly, we're always at that crossroads. It's just a matter of the longer we wait to take action, the worse it's going to get. So,
Yeah, man. Let's for this episode close it here.
okay.
We've touched on several topics, and I believe we did well. Let's pick it up again if you are interested in coming back again and discuss more
It'll be,
specific things.
it'll be my pleasure. Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe take a look next time at some of the public health ramifications of urban development that we see in the modern times, like right now. What those let's kind of go into the weeds and identify what those issues are, and then kind of explore. Okay, now that we know the full range of effects that are caused by the urban planning and zoning law and development choices that have been made, once we identify all of those and really dig down and figure out where they all come from and how to deal with them, then we can start constructing a set of solutions that go about addressing these issues at a very fundamental level. Does that
Yep,
sound good?
yeah, that sounds awesome.
All
So,
right.
man, again, thank you for coming on the show and having this conversation with me. I believe it's like truly important. And
Yeah,
let's
thanks for having me. It's been a lot of
yeah,
fun.
awesome. So that was the today's episode. Thank you for coming along. I have been Moff and my guest Leone. We have been discussing about cities, housing, how the Soviet Eastern Europe environment tried to do things, and sometimes how it compared with the Western world. And we will definitely continue this series. Maybe there will be other guests coming along, but let's talk about specifics, because just talking about the great awesome something Marxism which will happen in the future is in my opinion, not enough. I believe we can have a proper discourse with high enough quality, and we can move on from the lame kind of Soviet Union bad, America good type of nonsensical stuff. And again, thank you for listening. Follow the channel, subscribe, all that stuff, share on the social media. If you have questions, do ask them in the comments. And let's see ourselves and hear next time.